So we can start officially with the session. Today we change a little bit how we conduct the meeting. We're gonna Ramzi, who appears as LDEM AUB, is gonna be letting people in because last time we were hacked, and so we're gonna be more careful this time so that our presentation is not affected. And Elsa, who was giving the presentation back then, is gonna record a new version of the presentation, and we will make it available to the project. This way, all our records are complete. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Carla Aramouni. Carla is an architect. She teaches in the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. She's also the coordinator of the undergraduate program in architecture at AUB. And the presentation has been given is based on a studio that she led a couple of years ago now, at the beginning of the project, where she tried to engage her their learning within the context of biosphere reserves. So Carla, I'll leave the floor to you. And I think for the sake of the recording, we will leave questions till last.
Thank you, Salma, and thank you for having me with you today. And I'm happy to be sharing the work that we did in 2019, actually, the fall semester. So I will share the screen from my end. Okay. So the title of my call, my presentation, I'm sorry, is Architecture and the Biosphere Environment in Pedagogy, Design Visions for Sustainable Dwelling Communities. Okay, so that title somehow tries to project what that course really was about, what it attempted to do. And the course was a design studio, so it's a 6-credit course that is project-based. It's an applied design course called Architecture and the Environment. And as I said, it happened during the fall semester of 2019 and was co-taught between myself, Nicola Fayyad, and Sandra Frem, who were senior lecturers at our department at the time. And the general, let's say, aim of that course, which is a 3rd-year level architecture course, is to generally introduce students to concepts of sustainability and the environment at large in the design of the building. But we were specifically, the 3 of us, interested in approaching it also from more of an extended environment point of view, looking at landscape and looking specifically at the biosphere as a continuum and as part of the architectural question. So rather than just approaching it as an architectural project, we tried to position the project that they want to do that semester in relationship to existing in conjunction with a biosphere reserve like that of Jabal Musa. So at the bottom of the studio, the premise really that we started with are these 2 frameworks or these 2 embedded questions. So first was, how can architecture or building in general work in synergy with nature rather than be external to it? How can it perform symbiotically to it? And in order to enhance the performance of the built environment in general. So this for us represented an ecological design framework within the architectural design. And then the second component was, how can architecture support the biosphere of Jabal Musa specifically, and offer new modes of communal living and working environments adjacent to this biosphere. So really it was about understanding the biosphere needs and what can be potential synergies that community living that we create through our design strategies can actually enhance and connect to the biosphere and serve it. So from this ecological design framework, really we approached it saying that how we see architecture today must be changed in order to think about it as an entity that is synergistic with nature and that is, as I said previously, also performing symbiotically with it. So rather than reducing or thinking of architecture only in its formal or spatial or programmatic capacities, we need to be rethinking and redesigning a much more sensible and productive architecture that links to its natural context and that can incorporate also active environmental functions. So with the aim of bettering both the built and the natural environments. So to achieve that, we really thought about this ecological framework as let's say, subdivided into three main scales or three ecological scales of interaction. That reference to research that we did was in parallel to how habitats in general function. So from the relationship to a large climatic or regional scale. So for us, this was translated into the relationship to the biosphere scale, to a more closer second scale of a terrain scale. So this was for us translated more towards the immediate environment or the habitat scale, and then to the biotic or the immediate biological scale, which for us translated towards the human level scale and the relationship with its community within the housing community development that we were working on. And second, from the biosphere needs and synergies, we tried, of course, to recognize this biosphere of Jabal Musa as a valuable zone that enables regional development and that has the potential to integrate new programs, especially in its buffer areas. An important side note to say here, this was the first time students were even exposed to the term biosphere, so they did not really know what it was about, and even for most of them, I would say the majority of them did not really know Jabal Musa specifically. So it was an opportunity for them to understand first the importance of biosphere reserves is sustaining both nature and life and the community around it, but also to visit Jabal Musa, and which they did, and they spent some time there, even I think stayed overnight and went around to even the villages and to talk to people who are there. So based on this, the idea was to incorporate new communal models for living and working close to these natural zones. So we were thinking about them, especially Jabal Musa, as an area that is not extremely far. So it's in an area that is, let's say, proximate enough to certain urban agglomerations. And if we think about Jaltoun, Balloune, these type of neighborhoods that are quite condensed, even though they are suburban, but that it can become a sort of escape, a halfway escape, where people can choose to relocate and live there and work there, and reconnect back to nature while serving a purpose that might benefit this biosphere. So these eat, live, work communities, as we labeled them, would support the reserve and would enhance the connection between the peripheral urban areas and these close by villages. So the chosen sites around Jabal Musa, where students were supposed to focus and actually build their projects around, were three main areas. So there's the village of Emez, and then the village of Mshete near Nahr al-Dahab. But the the Emez village was seen in its two areas, in its valley part, and then in its plateau counterpart, the higher area. So how to do this? This was one of our main questions, how to develop a design methodology that allows us to move from research, from understanding the biosphere, but also to cater for important issues of environmental performance, sustainability, thinking about how the housing unit versus the community unit can be sustainable and can have a well-tempered environment, while at the same time offering programs that can support the biosphere. So we did this really in three main steps, or three main phases and scales. The first one was we labeled engaged, or the biosphere reserve scale. So in this phase, it was about understanding the biosphere rigorously, engaging with it, visiting it, trying even to extract all issues that we found there from different layers, from natural systems to historical layers to others, to really understand what is there, what exists, and what is the potential then for new types of programs that can come into through these communal dwellings to support the biosphere. The second part was about performance, or the scale of the habitat. So at that point, it was about explorations of thermal performance and environmental performance at the scale of a housing unit. So trying to see how can, for example, based on a location near Jabal Musa, how can existing conditions from the ground condition to wind condition to sun condition, etc., how can they affect the way that we conceive of the architectural space? How can the form basically start to follow these conditions to create a well-tempered environment? And then the last one is activate, or the human community scale, which is where the students started to develop from the single housing unit that they initially worked on, to develop a community that comes together based on a certain new program. So each student tried to build on existing programs that they found around the biosphere and to propose a new sociocultural type of activity that can happen there that can benefit and support back the biosphere and the towns around it. So in the first one, as I said, the process of understanding the biosphere reserve really happened through in-depth research, through a lot of mappings or drawings, a lot of direct and indirect analysis. It also included fieldwork, as I previously explained, and tried to elaborate on the different layers of the site, from climatic to environmental factors, from local existing ecosystems, from spatial typologies of buildings that are already there and around existing architecture, to also socioeconomic realities of these neighborhoods. So these are some samples of the work that was produced during that phase, how students were really trying to understand the biosphere first in terms of its, let's say, its structure as a core that is also adjacent to a buffer area and a larger development area, but also trying to understand it in position, you know, to the greater scale of the Lebanon and in relationship to other criteria, in this case, like looking at different land cover distribution. And this is another example, trying to understand over the Jabal Musa area, also the, let's say in this case, the bird migratory routes, but also the two rivers that are there and the general, you know, flow of wind over that zone, also seen in relationship to Lebanon and the importance of these migratory routes that intersect somehow over the Jabal Musa area. Another example, actually dissecting through the mountain in its cross section with the two rivers, the Nahr al-Dahab and the Nahr Ibrahim on both sides, also understanding to a bigger extent the land cover. Of course, this was all based on existing information and data that they were able to find, but reinterpreted through their own drawings to kind of build, let's say, more relationships between things that they see at the surface, things that they see in plan, and then the relationship with the towns. For example, here Mshete is over here. Some groups also try to look at some examples of economic practices that are there, from like farming and grazing to the use of wood actually for I don't know, for logs or honey production, but also how the biosphere itself includes some recreational activities. And try to look at both areas. So the IMES, this is IMES area and entrance of the biosphere versus the Mshete area, and the different activities also that happen around both zones. And here to a larger also scale and depth, this is again the Mshete neighborhood, and these are different houses actually that the students went into and talked to their owners and understood a bit more the realities around here. Like the areas in red, for example, seem to be excavated, and some of the activities that are also supporting the biosphere, like the guest house or the restaurant that are over here. In addition to like the IMES plateau and this combination between excavations and quarries and agricultural terracing that happens very strongly over there. So moving on to the next phase, I'm just checking the time and to make sure I'm moving in the right pace. The scale of the habitat. So in this case, this is where it was a bit more, I would say, open-ended, a bit more exploratory. So it was about trying to give the students the space and the liberty to create spaces that can perform climatically and spatially, yet at the same time base it on important factors coming from the site. So they had to actually choose which village they need to work on. And then from that village, they needed to extract certain climatic relationships. So they can choose two, they don't need to deal with them all, at least not for the sake of that model. But for example, they can choose, for example, wind flow and the river, or humidity level, or the earth, the soil quality, or sun orientation, etc. They had to choose a certain architectural typology, be it a tower or a courtyard or others. And then they had to also choose a type of spatial experience that they wanted to elaborate on. So part of choosing these things together and trying to think about them as guidelines for design was to give the students not only the liberty to design, but also some guiding principles to base their models on. So as I said, it was open-ended. So students really started, for example, like if we look at some of these models, there was this clear intention between a tower that is connecting to a lower floor, that there would be a stack ventilation benefiting from a cross ventilation that happens specifically on site, and so on. So this is just one example. These are other examples that we can see also quickly, also based on wind and orientation, and trying to elaborate of how ventilation, for example, can be allowed while offering a non-standard type of space. So the idea was not to recreate just an architecture that's a block separate from its environment or its context, but that it can also blend with it and sit within the landscape, so that there's a blurring of these two boundaries together. This is another example of a student who was really interested in some cave structures that he found in the natural rocks in Emis, and was thinking actually of how he can benefit from underground or subterranean spaces to have a varying thermal comfort level, from like the colder to the hotter type of spaces, and then how that relates to light and ventilation internally. And another example also of like dissecting and using triangulations for multiple types of movements, part of which is also related to water even flow and water collection. So of course, these previous models, I'm not really showing that here, but these previous models developed each into a proposal of a single habitat or a single housing unit. And then from that single housing unit, the students were asked then to develop a communal housing strategy. So how do you bring this single unit into a multiplicity? How do you create a combination and ensure that with that combination that you have a proper relationship between outdoor and indoor, between the people living in that community, how they live together and work, or have spent time together. But more importantly was about proposing the potential program and user group of that community who would relocate to this vicinity of Jabal Musa. So who are these people and how are they related to the area that are there? So students had to really propose something more specific and not really say, okay, random people from anywhere can just come and live here. So this proposed program, really, the point was that it would serve as a link between these incoming inhabitants and then the local area and its people, and as a potential communal and sustainable space that links to these existing synergies that we talked about in the beginning and the resources in the different towns. So for example, this diagram that we're seeing on the right is trying to elaborate between the user groups, which are which could be young youth, but also families that relocate to that area, but that would connect to the Jabal Musa biosphere through specifically honey production, for example. So the student was looking at practices of honey production that he found in the area and said that this can be a viable community that lives and works and has what's the word, like a holistic type of living based on this economic use of the honey production that can also serve the biosphere and can be sold in a way to help support the biosphere and its needs. So this is an example of that project actually as it developed more towards a community dwelling. It was based in Mshete as the village, but really it integrated actually the existing terraces in Mshete. So if you know the site, there's this long stairs that takes you up to the Biosphere Reserve entrance from the Mshete site. So that student actually chose to build through these existing terraces, but actually to manipulate them and formally start to break through them, to integrate the houses inside that stone wall terrace, and sometimes occasionally going out of the terrace into a double height space to create a main area of production. So here, this is where the more, let's say, process-oriented production of honey can occur, while the highest, for example, would be right there at the top, closer to the Biosphere Reserve. So this is again like the scale of the dwelling, where you start to see the different dwellings. Of course, here in this image specifically, they seem to be just this same type, but in other moments on the site, he had also elements that were double height, so double floor for larger families, and single one bedroom for smaller families or individuals. And the example also of how each one of these units, in addition to being open from the front, also had skylights and cross ventilation from the top, in addition to water connection. So the idea was that there's always a collaboration between the different systems at hand. So of course, environmentally performative, but also think about water collection, think about agriculture as and landscape as part of this community's livelihood, and so on. Another example, the student was quite actually interested by the Emis Plateau rocky formations, and actually he found a lot of nomads and shepherds actually in around that area. He was interested how some of them were using some of these caves for shelter, and he wanted to build on that in his earlier explorations of subterranean dwellings and environmental performance and thermal comfort, to propose actually that this development, this housing development, continues as these carve outs inside the rock that allow more of these wintertime visitors, or actually summertime visitors, the nomads, to come into that space and use it as they also bring their cattle there. But that can also double serve as a purpose for a guest house or visitors who might be coming towards the Biosphere Reserve to also spend time there in these dwellings. So what we're seeing here is the plan that where certain spatial formations start to occur inside these caves, and then in section you would have basically these different openings and this varying level also of thermal comfort depending on the program. So he was usually like maintaining the living areas, the areas they spend the most time in with the hotter or the warmer type of space, and even like was learning from materials that shepherds use in their tents to also think about them as covers that can start to create an enclosure when needed, of course, in winter. Third project was by this student, by Leah, and her interest was on the site that is related to Mshete's terraces. She was really interested in them as an agricultural area that already has in it, I think, grapes, and that has also in it vines that were already there, and a structure of vines. And she wanted to incorporate her project actually on these terraces again, but instead of trying to completely integrate with it, she was interested actually in how her intervention, her spatial intervention, can start to go out from the terraces and propose spaces that sort of float in between to create these different thermal comfort levels that she was trying to create. So she was trying to create these different courtyards and then spaces that hover around, that allow people to meet, but also that would allow movement around her volumes at multiple levels to connect down from the top level all the way down to the terraces. So her user group, she was thinking about it as a space that can serve the elderly and children. So mostly she was thinking of, I think, orphans. So and a communal living that caters to both user groups and that allows them to also live together, but also support and be part of the productive landscape around it. Excuse me. So this is a bit more of her explorations at that level, and how in section also her project appears. And then the fourth project by Miriam Abu Adal, excuse me, in her case focused on a community of botanists who would move to the area around the MS Plateau. And her idea was to create a productive housing system that includes agricultural terracing in its form, so that the roofs themselves can be planted, and that these would incorporate both their spaces for study, their labs, but also their housing units, so that they can work and live as they're studying also botany, specifically from the area around Jabal Musa. Her proposal also included a very, let's say, sorry, a very sensitive, she took a lot of care, let's say, to existing rocks and trees that she found around the site, and tried to build her architecture and volumes around it, and used also the slants of the topography to start to gradually bring her project down, connecting between higher levels of the site and lower levels of the site, while the roof is always plantable, accessible, and part of this continuously landscape area. She also thought of infrastructure, so she was also thinking about how water is collected throughout these different levels, how it can be reused. She was thinking also, of course, about sun and protection from the southern and harsh sun, and so on and so forth. I'm at the end of my presentation. I'm sorry, it's because of allergies. I tend to cough a lot sometimes. So I'm just gonna go to the last slide, and really like the synthesis of the work that I showed today. So what we really tried to do in that studio is to try to bring both the research and the understanding of biosphere reserves right to the heart of the architectural studio and discourse, to position it as an essential subject that students could and should engage with, in order to propose more holistic and sensitive integrations of integrated architecture with the environment. So the biosphere itself, of course, served as a model of reference, as an ecology that includes necessary synergies between people, the natural environment, in all its encompassing richness, from the ground layers to the atmosphere. So this was let's say the model of reference for us, upon which we also thought of these communal dwellings at another scale, of course, that they also have this synergy between production and living and landscape and the environment at large. Architecture as such was seen and developed as a continuity of this ecosystem, as an inherent and synergistic space that engages with its surrounding and the community at large. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla, for a very interesting work by the students, and it's interesting to see how the Biosphere Reserve becomes the basis on which they start designing and finding solutions and opportunities. The floor is open for questions. I see there is one question. If you can see it in the chat, Carla.
Yes. In the project development of the integrated community dwellings, what about interactions with local stakeholders and authorities, then their involvement in the project design itself? As I said, the students did go to the biosphere, they visited it, they met also with some of the, I think, people responsible who are there. And they did, in their own research and their own fieldwork, they did go and talk to people that they found around. So that was more done, I would say, slightly less formally. It wasn't really very formal, more informal, and it was really based on each student's interpretation. So we did not, I would say, engage the stakeholders and authorities to a higher level, partly because as an architectural project or a studio, it had a lot of course learning requirements that the students needed to attain, that we did not want to live in from municipalities, let's say, or other authorities. So we really wanted to keep the students the flexibility to create their own proposals, while at the same time having some interactions with the locals that are there. Of course, that happened also, and I have to say, in the fall 2019. So October 17, Thawra, we stayed at home for 1 month, and then we had to completely, restructure how we were running the studios, partly online. So I wouldn't say also, I think we were also disadvantaged from, we weren't able again to really like engage deeper with the site or go more or talk more to people. So there was also the break because of the situation at the same time.
You also have a follow-up question. Go ahead, please.
The person raising your hand? Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And it's always very inspiring what the students can do, in particular architects. Yeah, I raised this question about engaging with the community, because this is what you announced as a purpose of this project, to develop it in a synergistic way with the environment, let's say, and the local community. So when we usually pay a lot of attention and efforts in describing the environment, you have showed a lot of maps, and I think they've collected a lot of data and observations on the physical environment, I would say. We usually then go for a more informal approach with the human component of a biosphere reserve and of a territory, and perhaps this could deserve a bit more attention. I think, what about the level of acceptance of some ideas and inspiration projects like that can give to the local community? What are their own needs? So because we can start, very nice project, but based on assumptions that this would be fantastic, but is it really needed? Would it be properly managed in the future? All these things, I think, require, more attention and data, and a kind of more systematic approach to that. So probably we cannot ask architects to do anything and everything. So perhaps that's part of a larger team where you work with anthropologists or sociologists, economists, and start looking at the feasibility of similar ideas in a wider context. That's something we are very interested in biosphere reserve in general, because it's about nature and people. So let's pay more attention to the people components. That's something we don't do often so far. So, but I can also understand that there could be restrictions due to COVID and other restrictions, but I had similar experience in the past in Italy, in Croatia, in Greece. That was very interesting, and usually the teams were multidisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So just to avoid, we just bring one dimension. There were agronomists, biologists, in fact, sociologists or anthropologists, economists. That's interesting to see this kind of work, embedded in this kind of teams. So that was part of the experience we made so far a few years ago.
No, that it makes a lot of sense, of course, what you're saying. And then the framework, of course, and the setting would be quite different. Ideally, in projects like this, I completely agree. Multidisciplinary teams, and really like much more on-ground relationship with the people who live there, and what could be also, but not only who live there, but also who serve and are already part of the stakeholders of the biosphere. That they can be a part of the project and the thinking and the imagining of this project. Of course, we had to navigate, between having it as a core course for architecture students in their third year with very strict requirements, yet at the same time expose them to the issue of the biosphere, have them visit it, talk to people there, and try to get some sort of understanding. Of course, a lot of their assumptions were based on things that they found and saw there. So whether it is talking to people who are involved in honey production and seeing that there's a potential in it to continue from it, or whether it is, talking to individuals who are, let's say, in Mshete village, realizing that there's a majority who might be of a certain demographic, and then trying to propose something more for the elderly, etc. So they were not completely, let's say, based on just personal assumptions, but they were coming from observations that each student went through. But I understand completely, and I completely agree. Like, this may be a proposal of a project, definitely in a different maybe context or framework, would benefit a lot from having a much larger multidisciplinary team to really assess viability, relationship to the existing demographic, and so on.
Yeah, thank you. I fully understand. Let's say, when you started presenting, I thought about designing with nature, which is something not new, coming from the 60s. For the Biosphere Reserve, we expect designing with nature and people. That's the point. And perhaps we need some more systematic approaches in that. It's perfect that they had contacts, and for sure they've collected impressions and data from the meetings with people on the ground. But then this is not, let's say, given to us as the fruit of a systematic approach with some data that could be help other to understand how to approach that in terms of project development, I would say.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I think just to also shed light on one issue, I think the interesting thing about how the course proceeded is what Carla was talking about in terms of learning outcomes. So there is a difference between engaging students in a project or a workshop outside the scope of a course. But at the same time, what is interesting here is that how we can align between meeting the course learning outcome that is quite rigid and strict, but yet base it on activities or a topic related to biosphere reserves. So my thinking is that had the situation been normal in Lebanon specifically, but also in the world, if you remember at the time, Carla, the idea was that after this course, we were going to a winter school. We were going to together as a multidisciplinary team from all the different partners. And the idea there was to discuss our preliminary findings and to see how to move forward. But all of that came to a halt, and we could not really proceed with this collaboration. So what Carla is showing is the initial effort that we could not follow through because of these restrictions. But the intent was to build on the course, her course and other faculty courses, and to discuss them amongst ourselves to see how we can move forward with actually joint projects between the students.
And
I understand pretty well, thank you. And perhaps this could be a starting point for building, you call it a winter school. So far, I made more summer schools because I was in the northern part of the Mediterranean. But then definitely that would make a lot of sense. And I'd like we could explore that for the future. I'm working now, after working in Europe, in Asia, I'm in headquarters in Paris. And I'm responsible for Arab states region and the MAP program on one side, also developing thematic networks and activities. And I think this kind of cross-disciplinary education based on concrete cases where you associate, of course, architects, but with hydrologists, and ecologists, and other disciplines, that could be very interesting. Develop as a kind of model for those schools, really fully benefiting from being on the spot of places which offer all these dimensions to be integrated. So yeah, we could discuss that in the near future. after COVID is over. You cannot make that kind of school webinars. That's not possible.
Any questions or comments from?
As a follow-up, Selma, to your comment, also there's a question by Amina.
Yes.
She's asking, how have the local communities reacted to the presence of the students and the projects they're leading? Again, unfortunately, we were planning that there would be presentation in front of like local stakeholders and the municipality after the students finalize their projects, but unfortunately, also because of the situation, we never really did do that. So yeah. It was unfortunate, yeah, definitely. But hopefully in a future, maybe version of a similar studio or a similar methodology, that the connection with stakeholders can be reimagined really from the beginning to be a stronger component and have the students engage more, but also present the thinking process that they're going through to them.
Any questions, comments?
If I may, I don't want to monopolize the, but then when I saw some proposals using the underground kind of apogene structures, so I remember my visit to Matera in southern Italy, and all the interesting studies they made about, in fact, climatic aspects, water management aspect, but even soil fertility aspect related to that. So is there a tradition of this kind of buildings or way of living in some parts of Lebanon? Because the Matera comes from I think 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. So that's really something coming as a traditional way of occupying specific places. Yeah,
I mean, in Lebanon, in the north, for example, there's a lot of also dwellings that are part of the rock and part of the ground. And I think this is anyway a move in recent sustainable architecture to gain from the Earth's thermal mass and then to bring back kind of this understanding into the thermal comfort of the space. So I think from that end, definitely, but it also comes, the studio really went through many series of exercises that I'm not really talking about all of them here, but part of the research, the first phase, in addition to understanding the biosphere, the students really needed to do several case study analysis of different projects, recent architecture projects, but also projects that are more integrated with their environment to understand how those behave. So a lot of those also natural dwellings, also looking at how certain organisms, for example, like the termite mounds also operate and functions as thermal entities, were also part of the research and understanding. So they were inspired from a lot of this data that came throughout. But that student specifically also found certain caves in Imiz upon which he, proposed his project as a second development.
Okay, so comments, suggestions, questions? Okay, so I want to thank you all for attending today's session. I hope you will join us again next week. And please remember this session is recorded, so you can share it. It will be on our project page. And I hope to see you next week. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Carla, for taking the time to present your work in the project. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Selma.
See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
What will be the subject next week?
There is a seminar series. If you like, we can send you the invitation with the calendar of presentations.
Yeah, I had just the invitation for today, but not knowing exactly what would be the subject. So it's nice because it's always a nice surprise. And so It's
Yes,
interesting,
we will send
inspiring. But I
you.
like to, because if I have to make some choices sometime in my timing, so that would
Yes,
be
we will
helpful.
make
Yeah.
sure to send you the calendar of the seminar series.
Emilia
Thank you for
just shared
taking
it
the
on the
time
chat.
to attend.
Excellent.
Emilia just
Okay.
shared it on the chat box.
Okay.
There is a link in the chat now, so you can find it.
Oh,
This
great.
is the link. Yeah. Okay. So this
Thank
is
you.
the link to the series. Okay. Thank you,
See you next week.
everyone. Bye
Have a
bye.
nice day. Bye.